The moment they drag me out of the throne room in chains, I start laughing. Not because it's funny, because it's insane. My own father just called me a disgrace in front of the entire court, and my little brother is standing behind him wearing a smile he's been practicing his whole life for this exact moment. Guards on both sides, iron cuffs biting into my wrists, and somewhere in the back of that crowd, a princess I've never spoken to is watching me get thrown away like garbage, and for some reason, out of everyone in that room, she's the only one who isn't smiling. I'm Doran Ashworth, third son of House Ashworth, and as of this morning, I officially have 0 magic worth mentioning, no sword talent, no elemental affinity, not even a decent stat line. In a kingdom that worships strength the way priests worship gods, that makes me worthless, so they exile me. Not to a comfortable manor somewhere quiet, to the hollow reach, a cursed strip of dead land on the border where the soil is gray, the wind never stops screaming, and nothing has grown in over 100 years. People who get sent there don't come back. That's the whole point. Here's the part nobody in that throne room knew. The part that's about to ruin every single plan my family thinks they just executed perfectly. I'm not actually weak. I'm just the wrong kind of strong. 3 years ago, alone in the library nobody else in my family bothered to read, I found a skill that didn't show up on any stat sheet, any combat exam, any tournament bracket. A skill called Architect's Will. It doesn't hit hard, it doesn't glow dramatically or summon dragons. What it does is worse, in the best possible way. It lets me design structures that quietly rewrite the minds of everyone who lives inside them. Not crude mind control, something slower. Something nobody notices until it's already too late to fight it. Comfort that turns into loyalty. Architecture that turns into obedience. I call it what it actually is, even if it sounds ugly out loud. I build buildings that brainwash people, and they just exiled me to an empty wasteland with nothing to lose and nobody watching. Big mistake. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how badly my family underestimated me. House Ashworth is one of the 4 great houses of the Kingdom of Velmore, and my father, Duke Halric Ashworth, has spent his life on one obsession: power has to be visible. If you can't summon fire or split a boulder with a sword swing, you're not worth his time. My older brother Farhan can do both. Golden Air, trains until his knuckles bleed, smiles like it's easy. My younger brother Win, the one smirking behind our father when I got dragged out, has a gift for illusion magic. Polite way of saying he lies to people's faces for a living and gets praised for it. And then there's me. No sword arm, no elemental core, just a quiet obsession with architecture and the strange old magic buried in books nobody else bothered to read. For years, that made me the family joke. Then I found the book, tucked behind a shelf of old tax records in the East Archive, bound in cracked black leather, no title on the spine. Inside, blueprints that didn't look like any architecture I'd studied, rooms shaped to calm the nervous system. Hallways angled to make people feel obedient without knowing why. Foundations layered with what the book called resonance runes, symbols that don't cast spells so much as they hum, quietly reshaping the emotions of anyone who stands on top of them long enough. I tested it on a single dusty guest room first. Small, careful, nothing dramatic. Within a week, the maid assigned to clean that room started requesting it specifically. Said it made her feel safe. Said she didn't want to explain why. That's when I understood what I actually had in my hands. This wasn't a party trick. This was a weapon nobody in my family had a name for, because nobody in my family had ever needed one that worked this quietly. I kept it hidden for 3 years. Practiced in secret. Filled a private notebook with sketches, symbols, failed experiments, and small successes. I told myself I was being careful. Really, I think some small, stupid part of me was still hoping my father would notice something else about me before I had to prove myself with this. He never did. And this morning, during the annual strength trials in front of half the nobility of Velmore, that finally caught up with me. The trial is simple in theory. Every heir demonstrates combat magic in the central arena, ranked publicly, humiliated publicly if you fail. Farhan shatters a reinforced pillar with one strike, and the crowd roars like he just won a war. Win weaves an illusion so convincing half the judges flinch, thinking a real monster appeared in the ring. Applause. My father's rare, tight smile, the one he saves for people who make him look good. Then it's my turn. I raise my hand the way I'd practiced. Nothing happens. not a spark, not a flicker. Because Architect's will doesn't work like combat magic. It doesn't perform in a 5-second window for a screaming crowd. It works over weeks, inside structures I build with my own hands. There's no way to show that off in an arena built for lightning bolts and sword strikes. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I've ever heard. Someone in the crowd laughed first, then more of them. My father didn't laugh. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a stain you finally decided to get rid of. And that was somehow worse than every mocking voice in that stadium combined. "Take him to the Hollow Reach," he said, not even raising his voice, like he was ordering dinner. "A house cannot carry dead weight." That's the line that ended up in every noble gossip circle by nightfall. Dead weight. My own father's public verdict on his own son, delivered in front of half the kingdom, including the one person I never expected to react to it at all. "I told you a princess was watching. Her name is Princess Alira Varenmore, second daughter of the ruling royal line. Here that day representing the crown at the trials the way royalty does at every important noble event. Mostly to be seen, rarely to actually care. I'd heard of her, obviously. Everyone has. Sharp, unreadable, famous for turning down 3 separate political marriage proposals from families twice as powerful as mine. What I didn't expect was for her eyes to be the only ones in that entire arena not laughing when I failed. She wasn't smiling in pity either. She looked curious, like she'd just watched someone lose a game everyone else thought had already been decided, and she wasn't so sure the game was actually over. I didn't have time to think about that then. I had chains on my wrists and a wasteland waiting for me. They marched me out through the lower gate 2 hours later, past servants who wouldn't meet my eyes, and a small crowd of nobles who very much wanted to meet my eyes, just so they could enjoy the look on my face. Farron didn't show up to say goodbye. Wynn did, just long enough to lean in close and whisper 4 words that I am never, ever going to forget. "Don't die too fast." Then the wagon door slammed shut, and 3 days later, I was standing alone at the edge of the Hollow Reach, watching the escort ride away without looking back. The gray wind screaming across dead ground that hadn't grown so much as a weed in a century. Here's what I didn't say out loud. Not to the guards, not to my brother, not to anyone in that stadium. Thank you. You just handed me an entire empty kingdom's worth of land, 0 supervision, and every reason in the world to build something you'll regret ignoring. The first night in the Hollow Reach nearly killed me, and not in a poetic way. The wind cuts through everything. The ground's too poisoned for crops, and the nearest town, a half-abandoned outpost called Greyfen, sits 2 days' walk away and treats exiles like plague carriers. I had a bag of supplies, a knife, and the black leather book that got me into this mess. Around midnight, freezing, I opened it anyway and started reading by firelight, because what else was I supposed to do? That's when the notebook did something it had never done before. A line of text I'd never noticed shimmered faintly on the inside cover. Gold letters rising out of old ink like they'd been waiting for exactly this moment to appear. Architect's will. Dormant tier complete. Foundation unlocked. I stared at it for a long moment, heart pounding, half sure the cold was making me hallucinate. Then more text bloomed underneath it, and I realized, sitting alone in a dead wasteland with nothing but chain-shaped scars on my wrists, that the skill I'd spent 3 years hiding from my family wasn't finished growing. It had a second stage. And apparently, total isolation, total desperation, and total humiliation were exactly the conditions it needed to unlock it. The system, if that's even the right word for it, laid it out plainly. At dormant tier, I could only design small resonance effects, subtle mood shifts, minor loyalty nudges, nothing that could survive real pressure. At foundation tier, I could build full structures, actual buildings with layered resonance architecture strong enough to reshape how dozens, maybe hundreds of people felt just by walking through the front door. I didn't have hundreds of people. I had one abandoned watchtower half collapsed near the edge of the reach, and myself, so I started there. For 2 weeks I barely slept. I mapped resonance lines into the cracked stone floor with scavenged chalk and my own blood when the chalk ran out, because the book was specific that intent mattered as much as material. I redesigned the tower's interior proportions from memory, angles meant to calm fear and encourage trust. The same principles from that first guest room, now amplified through an actual system tier instead of guesswork. Slow, exhausting work, hauling stone with hands that had never done labor a day in their pampered life. Some nights I thought about walking back to Greyfen and begging for scraps instead. Then, on the 15th night, the first traveler stumbled into my half-finished tower looking for shelter from a storm, and everything changed. His name was Bram, a deserter from some border regiment, half-starved, terrified of being caught and executed for running. He expected an empty ruin. Instead, he found 4 walls that somehow felt warmer than they had any right to be, resonance lines humming quietly beneath the floor, and within an hour of sitting by my fire, this man who by his own admission trusted nobody was telling me his entire life story like we'd known each other for years. By morning, he asked if he could stay. I said yes. What I didn't tell him was that the moment he'd walked through that doorway, the resonance architecture had already started working on him, gently, wrapping around his fear and loneliness and turning it into something that looked a whole lot like loyalty. He wasn't being controlled like a puppet. That's not how it works. He was just feeling, for the first time in a long time, like he belonged somewhere. And that somewhere had been built entirely by me, for exactly this purpose. That's the part nobody warns you about when you start playing with power like this. It doesn't feel like villainy from the inside. It feels like kindness. And that should have scared me a lot more than it did. Bram became worker number 1. 2 more deserters found the tower a week later, drawn by rumors of a strange exile who fed anyone who showed up and asked nothing in return except help rebuilding. Then a group of refugees fleeing a border conflict I hadn't even heard of arrived exhausted, and left 3 days later volunteering to expand the walls before I'd even asked. Word travels fast when you're the only warm shelter in 100 miles of dead land. By the end of the 2nd month, my crumbling watchtower had become the anchor of an actual settlement. Small, rough, nothing that would impress the capital, but every person inside those growing walls worked harder, trusted faster, and stayed longer than made any logical sense. And the only person who understood exactly why was me. I named it Ashvale, partly after my own name, partly as a quiet, private joke about rising out of exactly the kind of ash my family thought they were throwing me into. Word of Ashvale reached my family faster than I expected, and not in the way I wanted it to. 3 months in, a courier arrived from House Ashworth, official seal and everything, carrying a letter I read twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining the tone. My father had heard rumors of an exile building some kind of camp, and wanted confirmation it wasn't an embarrassment reflecting on the family name. Not concern. Just damage control, in case my continued existence made him look bad by association. I sent back exactly 2 words, still alive. He didn't respond. Farron did, unofficially, warning me not to embarrass the family further. Wynne sent nothing at all, which honestly felt like the most honest response of the 3. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because 6 months into building Ashvale, with the population climbing past 200, the resonance architecture spreading through every new structure I raised, and a genuine functioning town starting to take shape out of what used to be dead ground, someone else showed up at my gates. Someone I recognized instantly, even wrapped in a plain traveling cloak with the hood pulled low. Princess Alira Varenmore, alone. No royal guard, no announcement. I stood there staring at her like an idiot for a solid 10 seconds before I remembered to actually speak. "You're a long way from the capital, Your Highness." She pulled the hood back just enough to let me see her face, sharp-eyed, unreadable as ever, though there was something almost amused pulling at the corner of her mouth. I heard a rumor an Exile built an entire functioning settlement in the Hollow Reach in under a year. I wanted to see if it was true, or if the nobles gossiping about it were just bored. And now that you've seen it, now I have more questions than I started with. That should have worried me. A royal showing up unannounced at a worthless exile's worthless settlement is never just curiosity. But there was something in the way she studied the layout, the calm efficiency of a place that shouldn't logically exist, that told me this wasn't a political inspection. This was personal. I gave her the tour myself, which in hindsight was either the smartest decision I made that year or the most dangerous one. I walked her through the growing market, the shelters, the training yard Bram had insisted on building. I didn't mention the resonance architecture humming quietly under every floor she walked on. I definitely didn't mention she, too, was standing inside a structure designed to make people feel safe, trusting, and inclined to stay. Here's the problem I hadn't planned for. Royal bloodlines carry old protective magic, faint traces of it in every Varenmore for generations. And that magic doesn't just sit there quietly. It reacts to foreign resonance the way a warning bell reacts to smoke. I didn't know that yet. I found out the hard way, halfway through the tour, when Illyra suddenly stopped walking in the middle of my main hall, tilted her head like she was listening to something nobody else could hear, and looked directly at me with an expression that had gone from curious to sharp in half a second. "There's something in this floor," she said quietly. "Something old. What did you do to this building, Doran?" My heart dropped straight through the actual floor. I had exactly one choice in that moment, and it wasn't a good one. Lie to a princess with old protective magic literally humming a warning in her blood, or tell the truth to the one person in the entire kingdom with enough political weight to either save everything I'd built or destroy it in a single sentence to the crown. I told her the truth, all of it. The book, the resonance lines, the way I'd rebuilt my entire life out of a skill my family considered worthless, and the uncomfortable part too, that everyone in Ashvale who felt safe and loyal here was, on some level, feeling that way because I'd built the walls around them to make it happen. I braced for horror, for disgust, for the moment she'd call for guards that weren't there because she'd come alone. None of that happened. She was quiet a long moment, studying me, and then asked the one question I genuinely hadn't expected. "Does it work on royal blood?" "I don't know," I admitted. "You're the first one who's ever noticed it working at all." Something shifted in her face, something like relief, and it took me a while to understand why. Later, she'd tell me the real reason she'd come had nothing to do with idle curiosity. She'd spent her life inside a palace full of people whose loyalty was purchased, inherited, or faked, never certain who actually cared about her versus who wanted access to the crown. A place where loyalty was, in some twisted way, honest about being manufactured, felt more real to her than every fake smile she'd grown up surrounded by. That's the moment things stopped being simple. She stayed 3 days, officially studying an unusual case of exile self-sufficiency for the crown's records, unofficially asking question after question about the architecture, the book, my life before the exile. On the third night, standing on the half-finished wall overlooking a town that hadn't existed a year earlier, she said something I still think about constantly. "Your father called you dead weight in front of half the kingdom." She wasn't looking at me when she said it, eyes fixed on the growing lights of Ashvale below. I don't think I've ever seen dead weight build something like this. I didn't have a clever answer for that. I just stood there next to her in the cold wind, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel since the day those chains went on my wrists. Hope, maybe. Or something dangerously close to it. She left the next morning with a promise to return, and a warning I should have taken more seriously than I did. "My father is going to hear about Ashvale eventually," she said, mounting her horse. "When he does, it won't be curiosity that brings the crown here. It'll be strategy. Be ready." She had no idea how right she was, or how soon it would happen. Word reached the royal court 4 months later, and not through Illyra, through House Ashworth. Turns out my father, faced with a growing rumor that his exiled deadweight son had somehow built a self-sufficient settlement out of literal dead land, decided the smartest political move was to claim credit before someone else did. He sent an official announcement to the crown declaring Ashvale a sanctioned frontier development under House Ashworth's authority, conveniently leaving out the part where he'd exiled the person responsible for building it and hadn't sent a single supply shipment since. I found out about this through an absolutely furious letter from Illyra, delivered by a courier who looked terrified just carrying it. "Your father is trying to claim your kingdom," she wrote. "No formalities, straight to the point. The crown is sending an official delegation to assess Ashvale for potential royal annexation. If House Ashworth successfully claims credit, they will absorb everything you've built, and you will legally have no say in it. You have 3 weeks before the delegation arrives. Doran, you need a plan, and you need it now." 3 weeks to decide whether everything I'd bled, starved, and rebuilt myself for out here in the Hollow Reach was about to get stolen out from under me by the same man who'd thrown me away in the first place. I did not take that news well. For about a full day, I let myself sit in pure fury, the kind that makes your hands shake and your thoughts run in useless circles. Then Bram, who by now had become something between a bodyguard and the closest thing I had to a friend, said something blunt enough to snap me out of it. "You built a place that turns strangers into loyal people just by living here," he said. "You really think you can't outplan your own father in 3 weeks?" He was right, and it made me furious that it took him saying it out loud for me to remember what I actually had. Here's what my father didn't understand. Sitting comfortably in the capital drafting declarations about a settlement he'd never visited. Ashvale wasn't just buildings. It was a living resonance network, and every person inside those walls felt something for this place that ran deeper than gratitude. If House Ashworth wanted to claim it, they'd have to walk their delegation directly into the one place in the kingdom engineered to make people question loyalty they thought they already understood. I spent those 3 weeks on the most important architectural work of my life, redesigning the central hall, the building every delegation would have to pass through, layering the deepest resonance work I'd ever attempted into its foundation. Not crude control, something more precise. A structure built to strip away performance and force people to feel, undeniably, exactly whose hands had actually built the thing in front of them. The delegation arrived on schedule, 3 officials from the capital and, to my genuine shock, my father himself, apparently unable to resist seeing his newly reclaimed prize in person. He walked into Ashvale wearing the exact same expression he'd worn the day he called me dead weight in front of half the kingdom, like he already owned everything he was looking at. He barely looked at me. He looked at the buildings, the market, doing math about exactly how much political capital this settlement was about to earn him. Then I led the entire delegation into the central hall. I watched it happen in real time, the same way it had happened to Bram on that first stormy night, now amplified through months of refined work and aimed at people who'd spent their whole visit performing polite indifference. One official stopped mid-sentence, staring around the hall. An older woman who'd said almost nothing the entire tour suddenly turned to my father with a question that clearly wasn't in whatever script he'd prepared. "Duke Ashworth," she said slowly, "when exactly did you personally direct construction of this settlement?" My father hesitated. Just slightly. Just long enough. "My son executed the vision under House Ashworth's authority," he said, recovering quickly, the practiced political voice sliding back into place. The hall, quite literally, disagreed with him. I can't fully explain the resonance effect to anyone who hasn't studied architect's will directly, but the simplest way to describe what happened next is that the building itself made lying inside it feel wrong. Physically, uncomfortably wrong, to everyone standing in that room except me, because I was the one who designed it. My father's confident political tone started faltering. The delegation members exchanged glances, and then the older official asked the one question my father had clearly never expected to answer honestly in front of witnesses. "Duke Ashworth, did you, or did you not, exile this young man for demonstrating no combat magic, with the explicit intention that he would not survive?" The silence that followed was worse than the one in the arena the day I got exiled. My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of them good. And that's when I did the thing I'd been planning this entire 3 weeks, the moment I'd built this entire hall specifically to create. "Yes," I said, stepping forward before he could recover. "He did. I have the exile documents, his own written words, and I have 200 people living in this settlement right now who can confirm every single supply request I sent to House Ashworth over the past year went completely unanswered. My father didn't build Ashvale. He threw away the person who did, and now he's here to collect credit for something he actively tried to prevent. I had never spoken to my own father like that in my entire life. Every single person in that hall heard it happen. The delegation left 3 days later with a very different report than the one my father had clearly hoped for, and word spread through the capital fast enough that by the time I got Elira's next letter, she was practically laughing through the ink. "Your father is currently the least popular man at court," she wrote. "Congratulations. You've officially embarrassed him back." That should have felt like enough. It should have been the end of the conflict, the satisfying comeback moment where the villain gets humiliated and the story quietly resolves. It wasn't. Because 2 weeks later, Wynne showed up at Ashvale's gates alone, and what he told me changed everything I thought I understood about why my family had really exiled me in the first place. I almost didn't let him through the gate. Bram certainly didn't want to, arms crossed, ready to turn my own brother away without a second thought. But there was something in Wynne's face that stopped me. He didn't look smug like he had the day he whispered, "Don't die too fast," through the bars of that wagon. He looked exhausted. "5 minutes," he said. "Then I'll leave, and you never have to see me again if that's what you want." I gave him 10, out of curiosity more than kindness. What he told me, standing in the same central hall that had just publicly humiliated our father, rewired everything I thought I knew about my own exile. It wasn't about your magic, Win said quietly. Or it wasn't only about that. Father found something in the Eastern Archive 4 years ago. A prophecy fragment, badly damaged, that mentioned an Ashworth heir with a gift for what the old texts called foundation magic, tied to some kind of architectural resonance ability. He panicked. Foundation magic isn't tracked by any noble house because it's been considered extinct for 2 centuries. He didn't know which of us it would manifest in, but he knew it terrified him, because the same fragment mentioned it eventually surpassing every combat lineage in the kingdom, including his own. I stared at him, feeling something cold settle in my chest. So when I showed no combat magic, he assumed the worst possibility had come true, Win finished. That you were the one the prophecy meant. He didn't exile you because you were weak, Doran. He exiled you because he was terrified you were about to become something he couldn't control. The room went very quiet. Why are you telling me this now? I finally asked. Win's jaw tightened. Because he's not done. The delegation report humiliated him at court, and humiliated men do desperate things. He's petitioning an old Varanmore military alliance clause, one that lets a great house request royal forces to neutralize an unregistered magical threat inside kingdom borders. He's going to try to frame Ashvale as exactly that, a threat, and if the crown grants it, they're not sending another delegation next time. They're sending soldiers, I said. They're sending soldiers, Win confirmed. And Doran, I need you to understand something else, because I've spent my entire life watching you get treated like the family joke while I got praised for lying to people's faces with pretty illusions. I came here because I don't actually want to watch you die out here. That's the whole reason. Do with it what you want. I didn't fully trust him. Not completely, not after everything. But I believed him about this, because the alternative meant not preparing at all, and I'd already learned the hard way what happens when I underestimate exactly how far my family is willing to go. I sent an emergency message to Alira that same night. Her response came back faster than I expected, and it wasn't good news. The petition is real, she wrote. It's already gained support from 3 other great houses who see Ashvale's growth as a threat to their own influence over frontier territories. My father is genuinely considering it. Doran, I'm going to try to slow this down from inside the palace, but you need a defense plan, and you need every single person in Ashvale ready for what might be coming. That night, standing in the center of my own settlement, looking at the lights of a town 200 people now called home, I understood something with complete clarity for the first time since my exile began. Building Ashvale had never actually been the hard part. Keeping it was about to be the fight of my entire life. The next month moved faster than any month I'd lived through since the exile, which is saying something, considering how much had already happened. I couldn't outfight a royal military detachment. I didn't have soldiers, I didn't have combat magic, and I definitely didn't have time to train 200 farmers and craftsmen into an army capable of standing against trained forces. What I had was Architect's Will, a system that had never once stopped growing since the day I unlocked its 2nd tier, and I made the decision that if my family and half the great houses wanted to frame Ashvale as a threat, I was going to make absolutely sure that walking into it felt like walking into something worth protecting instead. I pushed Foundation Tier further than I ever had, redesigning Ashvale's entire perimeter into what the book called a bastion configuration, resonance lines running through the ground itself, connecting every structure into one unified network. The book warned this tier demanded a cost, something it called an anchor, a piece of the architect's own will bound permanently into the foundation stone. I didn't fully understand what that meant when I agreed. I understood it better the next morning, waking up feeling like some small piece of myself now lived permanently inside the walls of my own town, belonging to it as much as it belonged to me. It worked. Whatever it cost, it worked. The soldiers arrived 19 days later, 400 strong, under royal banners, led by a commander named Vosk, who'd clearly been briefed to expect a dangerous unregistered threat, and instead found himself riding into what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary frontier town. That illusion didn't survive contact with the gates for long. The moment his forces crossed the bastion configuration's outer resonance ring, something shifted. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Soldiers who'd arrived tense, weapons ready, started slowing down. Not from fear, from doubt. The architecture wasn't attacking them. It was simply, patiently, making them feel exactly how absurd it was to point a sword at a market square full of children, at farmers hauling grain, at ordinary lives that looked nothing like the threat their orders described. Commander Vosk himself, hardened veteran, clearly not a man who scared easily, rode to the center of Ashvale and dismounted in front of me, looking deeply unsettled. "My orders are to neutralize an unregistered magical threat," he said slowly, glancing around at the market, the children, the ordinary chaos of daily life happening in every direction. "I don't see a threat, I see a town." "That's because it is one," I said. "Someone lied to your command about what's here, Commander, and I'd like the chance to prove it before 400 soldiers do something to 200 civilians that none of you will be able to take back." He studied me for a long moment, the weight of the decision clearly sitting heavy on him. Then he did something I genuinely hadn't expected. He ordered his forces to stand down and requested, formally, a full inspection before any action was taken, giving me exactly the opening I'd spent 19 sleepless nights preparing for. I walked him and his senior officers through Ashvale myself, deliberately routing through the central hall that had already stripped a lie bare in front of an entire delegation. I told Vosk everything: the exile, the resonance architecture, the prophecy fragment my father had panicked over 4 years ago. I held nothing back, because holding things back had never protected me from anything so far. Vosk listened in silence, and when I finished, he asked one question that told me everything about how this was about to go. "Duke Ashworth petitioned for military action against his own son," he said slowly, "based on a threat that, by your own account, he invented out of fear of a prophecy he never confirmed was even accurate." "Yes," I said. He turned to his officers, expression hardening into something that looked a lot like disgust, aimed in a direction that wasn't me. "We are not neutralizing a town full of civilians because a duke panicked about a rumor 4 years ago and is now using royal forces to cover his own mistake. That should have been the end of the crisis." Almost was, because that's exactly the moment my father arrived in person, riding hard behind a second, smaller escort, apparently unwilling to trust the outcome of this to anyone else, and walked straight into the middle of Ashvale's market square, wearing an expression I'd genuinely never seen on him before. Desperation. "Commander Vosk," he called out, voice carrying across the square. "My petition stands. That boy is not what he appears to be, and I have proof." "Proof," Vosk repeated flatly. "Or a damaged prophecy fragment and a decision you made 4 years ago that you're now trying to justify with soldiers." My father's face went pale, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched Duke Halric Ashworth, the man who'd called me dead weight in front of half the kingdom, genuinely not know what to say next. That's when Alira arrived. She rode into Ashvale with a full royal escort, official crown seal visible, and the moment she dismounted, the dynamic of that square shifted again. She hadn't just come to slow things down from inside the palace like she'd promised. She'd ridden the entire way from the capital herself, carrying something that made my father's face go from pale to horrified the moment she held it up. "I've spent the last 3 weeks in the Royal Archive," she announced, loud enough for the entire square to hear, verifying the exact prophecy fragment Duke Ashworth used to justify exiling his own son 4 years ago. "I have the full, undamaged version here, retrieved from the sealed section of the Crown's archive, the section Duke Ashworth apparently didn't have access to when he made his decision." She turned the page toward the crowd, toward Vosk, toward my father, and read the line that changed absolutely everything. "The Foundation-blessed heir will raise what was dead, and in raising it, protect the kingdom from the ruin its own fear would otherwise cause. Not a threat. A warning about exactly the kind of panic my father had already caused." The square went completely silent. My father stood there, 4 years of secrets and one very public exile suddenly reduced to a mistake, built on half a prophecy he'd never bothered to fully verify before throwing his own son away. Commander Vosk didn't hesitate after that. He formally withdrew the petition's legitimacy on the spot, citing falsified justification, and informed my father, in front of his own soldiers, in front of the entire town he'd tried to have neutralized, that this incident would be reported directly to the Crown as an abuse of the military alliance clause. I should have felt triumphant. I did, for a moment, watching my father's carefully built authority collapse in real time in the middle of the town he'd tried to destroy. But mostly what I felt, standing there in the square I'd built out of nothing, surrounded by people who trusted me for reasons that were at least partly my own design and partly, genuinely, real, was something quieter. Something like the first real breath I'd taken since those chains went on my wrists. My father left that day without another word, escorted out by his own diminished authority as much as by anything else. Illyra stayed. That night, standing on the same half-finished wall where she'd first told me dead weight doesn't build things like this, she said something that finally, completely changed the shape of everything between us. "My father is going to want a formal alliance with whatever Ashvale becomes," she said quietly. "Probably through marriage, if he has his way, because that's how the crown handles anything it can't fully control. And if he suggests you," I said carefully. She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable and warm and genuinely a little nervous crossing her face, which I'd never once seen from her before. "I'd tell him he doesn't need to force anything. I've already decided who I'd choose, if it came to that." I stood there in the cold wind, on a wall built out of dead land and stolen exile and 3 years of a secret I'd been terrified to ever show anyone, and understood that everything my family had thrown away as worthless was about to become the exact thing that saved me, built me a kingdom, and now, somehow, was standing right in front of me choosing me on purpose. No resonance architecture involved, no manufactured loyalty, just her. I should have known better than to think that meant the story was finally slowing down. 3 days after Illyra's declaration, a raven arrived at Ashvale's gates carrying a sealed letter from the royal archive. The same sealed section she'd pulled the true prophecy from. Inside was a second fragment, one she hadn't found the first time, badly water-damaged, dated over 2 centuries old, describing not one foundation-blessed architect, but a rival bloodline meant to oppose him, one whose name had been deliberately scratched out of every surviving copy in the kingdom's history. Whoever they were, the fragment made one thing chillingly clear. They weren't lost to history. They were still out there. And they'd apparently been waiting a very long time for someone like me to finally show up. That's when the real story was only just beginning. The letter shakes in Illyra's hand before I even managed to read the second line. Not from wind. From what it says. They weren't lost to history. They were still out there, and they'd been waiting a very long time for someone like me to show up. I read that line 3 times before it actually lands, and when it does, the cold of the hollow reach suddenly feels a lot less like weather, and a lot more like a warning I should have taken more seriously from the very beginning. Illyra doesn't say anything for a moment. She's still holding the fragment up to the lantern light, studying the water-damaged edges like she's hoping the ink will rearrange itself into something less terrifying if she stares hard enough. "There's a name here," she says finally. "Half of it anyway. Someone scratched the rest out, deliberately. This isn't decay damage, Doran. Look at the strokes." She hands it over, and she's right. The parchment is old, brittle at the edges, the ink faded to a dull brown in most places. But right in the center, where a bloodline name should sit next to a title, there's a jagged tear in the fiber itself, gouged out with something sharp enough to cut through 3 layers of parchment in one motion. Not time, a hand. Someone had wanted this name gone badly enough to physically destroy it, rather than just cross it out. "House Ver," I read aloud, squinting at what's left. "That's it. Everything after that's gone." "There were only ever a handful of great houses with a Ver prefix," Illyra says, already pacing, already thinking 3 steps ahead of me the way she always does. "Varenmore, obviously. Vermont, but they were absorbed into House Ashworth generations ago, and one more. One that isn't in any record I've ever seen taught at court. Which means it was erased on purpose. Which means it was erased on purpose, she agrees, and whoever did it had access to the Crown's sealed archive. That's not a random act of vandalism, Doran. That's someone with real power making sure nobody ever asks the question you're about to ask." I look down at the fragment again. Foundation blessed heir. Rival bloodline meant to oppose him. The words feel heavier every time I read them, like they're settling into my chest instead of just sitting on the page. I built Ashvale out of a skill nobody in my family understood, out of a book I found buried behind tax records nobody else bothered reading. I always assumed I was the first person in generations to stumble onto something like Architect's Will. Reading this fragment, standing in the same hall my father tried to steal 3 weeks ago, I understand for the first time that I might not be first at all. I might just be the first one in 200 years who lived long enough to matter. We need to know what happened to them, I say. Whatever house this was. Whatever they did, whatever they had, someone erased them from history and buried the fragment that explains why. That's not the kind of thing you leave alone. Illyra's already nodding before I finish the sentence, which tells me she reached the same conclusion faster than I did. The archive's sealed sections won't tell us anything more. Whoever scratched this name out was thorough, but erased history doesn't disappear completely, Doran. It goes quiet. It hides in places official records don't reach. Like where? She's quiet for a second, and when she answers, there's something careful in her voice, like she already knows I'm not going to like where this leads. Like border towns nobody important visits, like Greyfen. Greyfen, 2 days walk from Ashvale, the half-abandoned outpost that treated me like a plague carrier the day I arrived here in chains. I haven't been back since. I've had no reason to. You think someone from an erased bloodline is hiding in Greyfen? I think if I were the last surviving thread of a purged great house, hiding in a town too small and too poor for the crown to bother patrolling closely would be exactly the kind of place I'd choose. Great. Just what I needed. A cursed wasteland wasn't complicated enough on its own. We leave at first light. I bring Win along, mostly because he insists, and partly because after everything that happened with our father, I've found myself trusting him in small, careful doses, the way you trust a bridge you're not entirely sure is finished being built. He hasn't said a word about going back to House Ashworth since the day he warned me about the military petition. I haven't asked. Some questions you leave alone until someone's ready to answer them without being pushed. The walk to Greyfen feels different this time. Not because the land's changed, the hollow reach is still gray and dead and screaming with that same relentless wind, but because I'm not walking into it in chains anymore. I'm walking toward it as the person who built something out of it. That should feel like enough. Standing at the edge of that miserable outpost, watching its crooked rooftops come into view, all I actually feel is a low, steady hum of dread that gets louder with every step. Something about that scratched-out name is already under my skin, and we haven't even found who's hiding behind it yet. Greyfen hasn't changed much. Same half-collapsed fences, same suspicious eyes from the handful of locals who bother looking up from their work as 3 strangers, one of them recognizably royal despite the plain cloak, walk through the muddy main road. Word travels fast in small towns. By the time we've passed the second building, I can already see people whispering behind hands. Already see someone slipping away toward the edge of town like they've got somewhere urgent to be. Subtle, Win mutters. This whole town watched me walk in as an exile a year ago, I say. I don't think subtle's really the local specialty. We ask around carefully, not for a name we don't have, but for anything unusual. A stranger who keeps to themselves. Someone who's lived here a long time without ever fully belonging. The kind of person a town like this quietly protects without quite understanding why. It takes most of the afternoon and more than a few coins changing hands before an old woman running the town's only functioning tavern finally gives us something real. Her voice dropping low even though there's nobody else close enough to hear. You mean Corvin, she says. Stonemason. Lives out past the old quarry. Keeps to himself mostly, been here longer than I have, and I've been here 40 years. She pauses, studying me a little too closely for comfort. Funny thing, he's been asking about that settlement you built, boy, Ashvale. Asks about it more than a man his age has any business caring about frontier gossip. Illyra and I trade a look that says exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. We find the quarry an hour before sunset, a cracked stone pit half swallowed by dead scrubland, and the small stone cottage sitting at its edge looks like it's been carved directly out of the rock rather than built on top of it. Smoke curls from a low chimney, somebody's home. The man who opens the door before I even finish knocking is old, weathered, hands scarred in the particular way stonemasons' hands scar after decades of work. His eyes land on me first, and something in his expression shifts the moment he actually sees my face. Recognition sliding into place, like he's been waiting for this exact meeting for longer than I've been alive. Doran Ashworth, he says, not a question. I wondered how long it would take you to come find me. That's not the greeting of a random stranger. You know who I am. I know exactly who you are. He steps back from the doorway, gesturing us inside with a kind of tired resignation, like a man finally setting down something heavy he's been carrying far too long. Come in, all 3 of you. I imagine we have a great deal to discuss, and precious little time to waste discussing it politely. The inside of his cottage is exactly what I'd expect from a stonemason who spent his life alone. Sparse, practical, tools lining every wall. What I don't expect are the sketches, dozens of them, pinned across an entire wall near his workbench, and the moment I see them, my stomach drops straight through the floor. They're resonance diagrams. My resonance diagrams, or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. Foundation lines, structural angles designed to shape emotion through architecture, the exact principles from my black leather book rendered in a completely different hand, decades older by the look of the parchment, but unmistakably the same magic. You know architects will, I say, barely above a whisper. Corvin's face goes carefully blank in the way people's faces go blank when they're deciding exactly how much truth they can afford to give away. I know a version of it, he says, an older version. One your kingdom decided 2 centuries ago was too dangerous to let survive. House Veric, Elira says quietly. Something flickers across the old man's face at the name, pain and recognition tangled together so completely, I can't tell which one wins. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in a very long time, he says. Where did you find it? A prophecy fragment, I say, half of it scratched out on purpose, foundation-blessed heir, and a rival bloodline meant to oppose him. That's all we have. That, and the fact that someone worked very hard to make sure nobody could read the rest. Corvin lowers himself slowly into the single wooden chair by his workbench, and for a long moment he just sits there, staring at his own scarred hands like they belong to someone else entirely. House Veric, he finally says, was the original bloodline of Foundation magic. Long before your architect's will ever showed up hidden in some forgotten archive shelf, we were the ones who understood resonance architecture, who built with it openly, who used it to strengthen border towns and calm conflicts before they turned into wars. We weren't hidden. We weren't secret. For a while, we were respected. What happened? I ask, even though some cold part of me already suspects I'm not going to like the answer. Fear happened, he says simply. The same fear your own father clearly felt when he read whatever fragment convinced him to exile you. Power that reshapes loyalty without visible spellwork terrifies people who've spent their entire lives measuring strength by how loudly it announces itself. The Crown decided House Veric's magic was too quiet, too invisible, too impossible to properly control or predict. 200 years ago, they didn't debate the danger, they simply erased it. Every bloodline member they could find, every structure we'd ever built, torn down or repurposed, every written record scrubbed from the archives. His jaw tightens. The purge was thorough. It was meant to be. But you survived, Wynne says quietly, speaking for the first time since we walked in. I survived, Corvin agrees, because I was young, and because I was the one who volunteered to disappear rather than resist. There were others who fought. Others who tried to defend what we'd built. None of them are alive to tell you about it now. The room goes quiet except for the wind outside. That same relentless hollow reach wind that's been screaming across this dead land for over a century. I think about Ashvale, about the 200 people currently sleeping inside walls I built, trusting a version of exactly the magic that got an entire bloodline hunted to extinction. And something cold settles low in my stomach that has nothing to do with the temperature. There's something else, Corvin says, watching my face carefully, like he's deciding whether I'm ready to hear it. Something you need to understand before you build another single wall in that settlement of yours. What? Resonance architecture has a shadow twin, he says. For every structure that binds loyalty, calms fear, reshapes emotion through foundation and stone, there exists an equal and opposite principle. Unraveling magic. Where resonance builds trust, unraveling strips it away. Where resonance calms a room, unraveling can turn the exact same room against everyone standing inside it, using the very structure you built as the weapon. You're saying someone could turn Ashvale against me. I'm saying someone could turn Ashvale against everyone, he corrects, voice sharp with an urgency that wasn't there a moment ago. Your resonance lines aren't just protection, Doran. They're a live network humming through every wall you've raised. Unraveling magic doesn't need to break down your gates or defeat your militia. It only needs to touch your foundation, and if it does, that same architecture that makes people trust each other on sight could just as easily make them turn on each other instead. Loyalty and betrayal run on the exact same lines. It's only a matter of which direction the current flows. I feel sick. Genuinely, physically sick, in a way I haven't felt since the moment those chains first went around my wrists. Every single person inside Ashvale's walls right now is standing on foundations that could theoretically be turned into a weapon against them, and I never even knew the danger existed until this exact moment, sitting in a stranger's cottage 2 days' walk from home. Who knows how to use it? I ask. Unraveling magic? Who still has it? Corvin's expression darkens considerably. That, he says, is the question that should frighten you more than anything else I've told you tonight. House Veric's purge wasn't random. It wasn't just fear of Foundation magic in general. Someone specifically wanted our knowledge gone, and someone specifically benefited from making sure nobody remembered we ever existed. That kind of erasure takes planning. It takes resources. And it takes someone with a very personal reason to make absolutely certain the truth never resurfaced. You think whoever ordered the purge is still out there? I think, Corvin says slowly, that whoever ordered it 2 centuries ago would have needed a very long life, or a very committed successor, to still care about keeping that name scratched out of the Crown's own sealed archive today. Someone put real effort into destroying that fragment you're holding. Effort like that doesn't come from idle historical embarrassment. It comes from someone who's still protecting an active secret. Nobody in the room says anything for a long moment. Outside, the wind keeps screaming across dead ground that's finally, slowly, starting to show the first stubborn signs of life at Ashvale's edges, thanks to work I did without fully understanding what kind of danger I was actually building alongside it. Wind's the one who finally breaks the silence, and what he says next isn't about prophecies or purges at all. "I'm not going back," he says. I turn to look at him, and there's something in his face I haven't seen there before. Not since we were children, before our father's obsession with visible power carved us both into the shapes he wanted us to be. Something like relief, mixed with fear, mixed with a decision he's clearly been carrying alone for longer than tonight. Win. I mean it, Doran. He meets my eyes directly, none of the practiced smirk he's worn his entire life, none of the illusion-crafted confidence he uses on everyone at court, just him. I spent my whole life lying to people's faces because father called it talent. I watched him throw you away for not being loud enough about a gift he didn't understand and was too afraid to even name properly. I'm done being the son who smiles and says nothing while he does that to people. Ashvale needs help, real help, not from some polished court illusionist performing for applause, but from someone who actually wants to be useful. I want to stay. Farron's not going to take that well, I say quietly. Because it's true, and because someone needs to say it out loud before he commits to something this permanent. Farron's loyal to father, in a way I never quite managed to be, Wynn says, something tired settling into his voice. He'll see this as betrayal, maybe it is, from where he's standing. But I've spent this entire year watching you build something out of nothing, while the rest of our family tried to either destroy it or steal credit for it, and I know exactly which side of that story I actually want to be part of. Corvin watches this entire exchange with the quiet, careful attention of a man who's spent decades observing people before deciding whether to trust them, and when Wynn finishes speaking, the old stonemason nods slowly, like something's just been confirmed for him. Loyalty freely chosen, he says, almost to himself. That's the piece your architect's will can't manufacture, isn't it? The one thing resonance architecture was never actually built to replace. No, I admit, it can't. I've learned that the hard way more than once already. Corvin studies me for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifts, resolve settling over exhaustion, the look of a man finally deciding he's out of reasons to keep something buried any longer. There's something else you should know, he says slowly, before you leave this cottage and go back to your settlement believing you understand the whole shape of what you're actually standing in the middle of. What is it? The name on that fragment, he says. The one scratched out so thoroughly, it tore through 3 layers of parchment. He pauses, and the silence stretches long enough that I can hear my own pulse in my ears. I know exactly why it's illegible. I was the one who scratched it out. The room goes completely, utterly silent. You erased your own bloodline's name, Elira says slowly, disbelief threading through every word. From the Crown's sealed archive, yourself. Not just that fragment, Corvin says, and there's something in his voice now that sounds less like an old man confessing a secret, and more like a man confessing a sin he's never once forgiven himself for. Every surviving copy I could find. Every record. Every mention of House Veric that existed anywhere I had access to reach, over the better part of 40 years, one careful erasure at a time. Why, I ask, and my voice comes out rougher than I mean it to. You said the crown erased you. Why would you finish the job yourself? Corvin looks at me, and for just a moment, underneath the exhaustion and the decades of hiding, I see something that looks almost like fear. Because the crown's purge wasn't actually thorough enough, he says quietly. And because some truths, Doran Ashworth, are far more dangerous left intact than they ever were erased. He doesn't say anything else. He just sits there, hands folded, decades of secrets sitting behind his eyes, and the wind outside keeps screaming across a wasteland that's only just starting to remember what it feels like to grow something again.